Force on Force features the largest and strongest outdoor military organization in the country. These are the men and women who make it possible to enjoy the freedom to hunt and fish. It is with great pride that we bring you Force on Force podcast, coming to you from the Force on Force Talk.
Hey, welcome to the Force on Force podcast. I'm your host, Shawn Dalrymple. We're here for another great episode. Enjoying a lot what we're doing with this. We're here in the Force on Force Talk, the Tactical Operations Center. All our shows start in the Tactical Operations Center. We start our podcast. As you guys know, it's a busy time of year for us. Last week, we were in Shawnee, Oklahoma, the Outdoor Nation Expo. We're headed to San Antonio for the Texas Trophy Hunters. So we've been doing a lot of stuff, bringing a lot of content. Last week, I was on the We Are College Bass Fishing. It's going to kind of tie into what our guest is today. And earlier in the year, we had a guy by the name of Cody Prather on here to talk about one of our original camera guys from the TV show. And we talked about how I kind of ended up in Army Bass Anglers. And on We Are College Bass Fishing last week podcast, I talked about getting to go to grad school. And this week is the Airborne's birthday, the National Airborne birthday, August 16th, 1940. And I'm going to bring on somebody that's really instrumental in how I kind of end up at grad school. I tell the story all the time. My battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Leary, we know him as Gladius 6. Jim, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's cool to have you part of this. You know, Jim is not a huge outdoorsman, but there is a video floating around of you catching a big fish, a bass last week on a fly rod. And I know that when you get to do some fly fishing, you love it. And so you do have a little bit of tie into what we do in the outdoors. But, you know, how much do you like to fly fish for the listeners out there?
I take about 4 big trips a year. So, yeah, I'm not a big outdoorsman like you. I'm just fly fishing all the time. But I did catch about 8-pound bass on a 8-weight fly rod last week using a weighted line and a bluegill pattern. One of my buddies' ponds here in Alabama. And the video is funny because we're laughing so much because we had no idea there was something that big in that pond, but we threw it back in. And then I'm fishing Madison River up near Yellowstone in October. I spent most of COVID fishing the White River in Arkansas, and I've caught my biggest fish on the Green River in Utah, 28-inch brown trout. So I'm getting there. One day I might have the outdoor crown that you have there, Shawn. So a little bit of history about him. So I am a young captain in the 82nd Airborne Division and the Division Special Troops Battalion. And in comes this new battalion commander, Jim Leary, that has never been in the 82nd Airborne Division, always wanted to be there his whole career, and he ends up in the battalion. So I talk a little bit about I get to command a company there and what sets me on a path to what I really say to this day, if I had not commanded that company, I would not get to do what I do in the outdoor industry now because it set up the rest of my life to make the decisions that I made. But Jim comes in. I kind of want him to talk because this is for us, he and I, it's a really special week. We pride ourselves really hard about being paratroopers, so much so that when I went to the 101st Airborne Division, Jim calls me to give me this lecture about wearing the 101st Airborne Division patch and not the 82nd patch. Is that correct story? That's a correct story. And I commanded as a captain in the 101st, and I wasn't in the 82nd till a little later in my career, but, I was in good units. I was in the 7th Infantry Division in Just Cause, and then I mentioned my time in the 101st. But, yeah, I just needed to counsel you a little bit. Don't get up there and get crazy. Not everybody can wear the double A's on their right shoulder, so I didn't want you to, forget about that. But let me tell you something. Having Abe watch your back with the 101st as a combat patch is pretty special, too, so that's a good job. Hey, can I make a quick comment on my recollection of when we met?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's tied to Airborne, and this, maybe your audience isn't as familiar with some of the Airborne traditions, but if you have a malfunction when you parachute, you use your reserve. And if you use your reserve, everybody gets on the drop zone afterwards and they find this, your reserve pull, and they give it to you. And it's sort of a big deal because when you have a total malfunction, not everybody does that. I mean, it is as unique as a no-hitter. So, in Major League Baseball, there's been about 370 of those in the history of the baseball game. So major malfunction where your parachute doesn't work and your reserve, takes you to the ground and you live is a big deal. So I'm walking through my new battalion headquarters in the S3 shop, and we had just created this headquarters of sort of a hodgepodge of different kind of folks. We had some infantry, some combat support, all kinds of different folks in there. We ended up having 10 companies and 1,500 paratroopers, and we'll probably talk about that later. But I'm going through the S3 shop, which is this organization that does your operations. And in there is this young captain as an assistant S3 in one of these old gray desks. He doesn't even have an office, but he's got his name on his desk, and on the wall next to him, he's got a plaque or something, and he's got something else. And I notice his one plaque has his reserve, a handle from his reserve. And I go, "Hey, Dalrymple, did you have a total malfunction?" He's like, "Yes, sir, on my 6th jump." So when you go to airborne school, you jump 5 times, and then you go to your real unit. So his first jump after training, the first jump at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in the 82nd Airborne Division, is a total malfunction. He's got to pull his reserve, and he acts like it's just another day. So that was my introduction to Shawn Dalrymple.
Yeah, that's kind of it just was bred into us, training and everything. And, after you got through that malfunction, I ain't gonna lie to the listeners, the 7th was probably my most nerve-wracking jump I ever made. But it's like they say, you fall off the bike or you fall off the horse, you just get right back up. And I got right back up in the aircraft and jumped. And after that, I mean, it was all so much so that I might have given Jim a hard time coming to the 82nd Airborne Division about being a newbie after we knew that he was going to be there and I was going to command. I used to ask him when he was going to get a real combat patch. That was always my hard time. But, being in that battalion, we have a lot of history going back to the Airborne Test Platoon in 1940. There was a lot of lineage, and really, what I really want to talk was like leadership, what it meant from a perspective going on that deployment, those things that kind of set it up, what we kind of saw. Because I talked last week in the college fishing podcast, talked about our work that we do with the West Point cadets. A lot of stuff that I do with those guys go back to the coach, teach, and mentor stuff that you instilled in me as a company commander back in those days. That one of my most important jobs was to coach, teach, mentor young officers and NCOs.
Yeah, that's a big deal. And it's fundamentals, right? So, one of the things that I brought with me to the 82nd Airborne Division was a basic understanding of tactics, fundamentals, the basics, and fighting against complacency. Doesn't matter what unit you're in. If you have multiple combat tours, you know that you got to make sure your head is in the game, and you can't be thinking about something else. You can't be outside the wire thinking about what's going on at home. You got to be thinking about what's going on out in where you are. And so that kind of discipline that we instill in our young leaders is important. And it transitions to everything else we do in life. Right now I work for a big defense contractor. I've got a pretty decent role. And it's that same kind of discipline that I see in what we do for our current government customers. And it's and the basics even transitions over into the things we do with sports, right? And outdoors, right? I mean, if you're in the case of fly fishing for me, if some pattern's not working, I need to go relook at the water again. I need to go look under a rock to see what bugs are there. And don't assume that just because I got this glittery thing, it's going to work, or maybe my cast is off. But that's like that with anything. And I think that one of the things that, we had the opportunity to do is we led these young paratroopers for a long time. And when we were over there, that tour for 15 months, you've got to make sure you instill the discipline up front and you fight against complacency. So those are the big things. If you have the opportunity to teach those to those young West Point cadets and other cadets, the ROTC cadets that you taught right up here down the road in North Alabama. I mean, a lot of those folks, I know when I was there at your promotion a couple of years ago before you retired, you had people showing up, young kids that you had taught, and that's a big deal. And so I think it's making sure that you're instilling the discipline, but you're doing it in a way where they know that you love them, you coach, teach, mentor, you care about them, you put the organization first, you put your mission first. I mean, you don't want to ever be, viewed as self-serving, so, the more you give to your organization, the better. So I think those are some of the basics that we lived by.
Yeah. And so the listeners kind of understand, we're getting ready to go to Afghanistan. We do something that traces back to really what a lot of our history of the 82nd, really our brothers in the 101st did, which was form a brand new unit and some brand new fighting units to go to Afghanistan. A lot of our other, brothers and sisters in the 82nd, they had existing units, but you were asked and we were asked to form brand new units. So you got to instill that discipline, and it starts with doing the little things right. If you do the little things right, and that's the things that I took away from it. And I think those, you're right. Those are things apply not just in the military, but they apply to business. They apply to everything. I shared this. One of my really good mentors in the outdoor media industry, Wade Middleton at Carico TV, he makes a point of talking about the University of North Alabama and the college fishing team there. They don't have a coach and hadn't had one since, the whole time I was there to Alma, but he always makes a remarkable statement saying it amazes him that how well they still continue to function without a coach this many years later. And I think a lot of that goes back to those same principles that you taught me. I took those, and when I went to grad school and helped work with that team, I built some of those things at the ground floor, because you still see those 16, 17 years later in that team, because you do things right up front. It stands for a long time, and it doesn't matter whether it's in the military or the business world or whatever you do. It translates to sports really, really well. I do that with the boys, and all the time. I talk about it with them. You got to do the little things right before you can ever complain about anything big. If you're not doing the little things right, don't tell me about what the coach is not doing. If you're not taking care of everything that you're supposed to be doing first,
Yeah.
Yep. So I think that was kind of cool. We got to do a lot of fun stuff, which some people might call it crazy stuff in Afghanistan. I say, but we also got to see and the relationships that we still have today, not just like he and I, but with a lot of our soldiers. It's really, really cool. Like, and it was talking lieutenant colonel all the way down to private C5s, that some of it today. How cool is that? You're probably like me. We grew up watching movies, reading stories, and as you reflect back in your life and you think about that, how do you did you ever think that you would ever be in a position today to be that would be you, just like the stories you read about growing up? I'll share this story with you. I'll never forget that you were in Huntsville visiting. I was there with my mom, and I took my mom and my boys out to dinner. And I'll never forget my boys asking me why you did that, why you paid for our meal. And it goes back to a thought I had about the movie, The Patriot. He asked his dad, we go places, people buy you drinks, and men do things for you. Why did they do that? And I just asked that question because I think that it was a realization that day for me that the life that we lived in Afghanistan, the camaraderie we have throughout all our soldiers, that I didn't really understand until years later. Do you reflect back on that now?
Yeah, I think that organizations like the one we were in, units like the one we were in, where we experienced so much together, we still have our similar roles, right? I mean, you're always going to be one of my guys. And so, I'm going to take care of you. And the role we were in at the time, or, where I was and what we were doing, and I wanted to meet you for dinner, and you brought your mother and kids. I mean, I asked you guys out, but it was my job anyways, as your commander, So that's sort of how I look at it. Plus, you care about each other. I use a saying now that I used back then as well, and it's just a good leadership term when you're leading teams. 5 years from now, no one's going to remember the stuff we're working on. We're going to remember how we treat each other. So when you got some jerk on your team, the person acts that way, that's how I'm going to remember that person. You got somebody that you trust implicitly, has your back, somebody that understands where you're coming from. You've been through some of the same trials and tribulations. There's no way to fake that. It still exists to this day. And even like where you and I met with, Kreitz up there when you guys first retired up there at Fort Campbell, we fall back into these roles. And, it's that way when I see some of our leadership. General McChrystal, who I knew on the tour before I was there with you, General Rodriguez, I saw his aide out at something here with industry, Nora Mendez, and we were laughing about that night when we all went in there and got the three senators out of the helicopter, and so he's still laughing about you, showing up there and go, hey, I'm Captain Shawn Dalrymple from the 82nd Airborne Division, and I'm going to take care of you tonight. Never mind the fact that the commander of the 82nd Airborne Division was in that helicopter stranded with Senator Kerry, Senator Biden, and Senator Hagel at the time. And what's funny too is you talked about the guys we're in contact with. There was a show on one of the news media things where some guy from Blackwater was talking about how he went in and did that, and his guys did, and it was an absolute lie. And our guys from your company, Bravo Company, from my personal security detachment, they were blowing our phones up, wanting us to go do something. Well, I could care less about what they're saying 10 years later. I know what we did together, and I don't care what folks say. So it's a special bond that we have, and we're going to take it to our grave because that's sort of the way we are together. So and I wouldn't do it any other way.
Yeah, I think that's important from what we do. So I totally cherish that. I look at it this way. I think we're all kind of locked into that. I still see myself when we're around you or the guys. It's still always Captain Dalrymple, and I was talking to Master Sergeant Green the other day, fixing to retire. Master Sergeant Green, I always still see him as E5 Sergeant Green is my gunner, right? And he's forever be in my memory as that, not he's gone on to do great things. And I'm like, man, you just always that it's like you're locked in that time capsule, and how you remember each other as. I'll never, the first time I was getting close to retirement, I was calling him up, and I'd still call you sir or Lieutenant Colonel Leary, and he's like, call me Jim, and I'm like, man, that just doesn't feel right, because you're locked into that whole. Even though I'm retired as the same rank as him, you still don't feel that same. Yeah. You're still locked in, like, that's my battalion commander. That's that's how you kind of feel, and that's totally what makes special about what we do in the military. One of the other fond memories I have about being over there, we had some fishing boat hats that we bartered a lot of stuff with that. I don't know that.
I remember that.
There was a company that sent me a bunch of fishing boat hats, and so for the listeners out there, they were able to get us I don't know if you ever knew this, but I actually got steak dinners for the guys on Christmas Eve for exchange for a bunch of those hats. That was
all I know is you were bragging about these fishing hats. And of course, I'm Ranger qualified. So when you gave me this Ranger boat hat, I'm like, I don't want that thing. It's a different kind of Ranger.
Yeah,
right? So the guys love that stuff. You had a lot of extra things you did for your guys, and it was important, Shawn. And I think it's a tribute to your leadership, because the conditions that you lived in there at, the FOB Morales Fraser was austere, to say the least. And, one of the best days I had in command there was when we flew in Thanksgiving to you and the Pathfinders down there at FOB Kuchbach. And, you guys hadn't had hot chow in 6 months. And, it was that's sort of what we were dealing with at that point in Afghanistan, and, 06, 07 time frame. And you always did it with a smile on your face, and so did your soldiers. And same with the rest of you guys down there. And I spent a lot of time down there for that reason, because I think the other thing leaders do is they lead by example. And if you're going to have, soldiers in poor conditions, you need to be there with them. And so anyways, I think that's just part of being a soldier. I think that, and you're a paratrooper and in the 82nd Airborne Division or any of these other elite Army forces, you carry with you, not just the knowledge of the history of who was there before you, but we're representing the legacy of those great Americans that did incredible things for this country to get us where we are today. And I think people forget that. And, I think that there's a lot of sincerity when people say they appreciate what veterans do, but unless you've walked in our boots, there's no way to really know what you're thanking us for. So I think that when I look at what we do as veterans in the greater community, I feel like I'm giving back, and I still feel like I'm serving this country, even though I retired and, a couple years ago, because just the way that the people that were the veterans before us acted and how they sort of paved the way for us, and I think we did that for some of these folks coming behind us. So to, talk about, folks like, now Master Sergeant Green, sure, we may look at him or Sergeant Cause like these young sergeants, but now they're leading the Army and they're doing great things. And the lieutenants that worked for us, they're now colonels. I mean, I've got, a guy worked for me now is a 2-star general. I mean, it's so let there be no doubt. The only thing he knows is what I taught him, and he wouldn't be there today if he wasn't me. But it's a bond that you can't, ignore. So anyways, I mean, it's a special week for us. And I will tell you that of all the things I always celebrate, it's the fact that I'm a paratrooper and I commanded paratroopers in combat. That's a big damn deal,
I think what we do is really well is we like to tell the stories, and you couldn't have summed it up any better. One of the things that we do with our TV show is bring that human connection to what we did in the service, and I think it's very important to do that. I could talk about a lot of things for a long time with you. Some things I learned. We got other podcasts. We could talk about more things with you because I know you're a busy man and got a lot of stuff to do. I kind of ending with a theme that I'm kind of starting because I got asked a question a couple of weeks ago and it kind of sent me for a mind-boggling experience, right? I had never thought about it. So it's really end with this is what's your most favorable memory in the outdoors and what kind of life lesson can you leave us with? And it was really my memory in the outdoors because I couldn't narrow it down to one. I could just tell you. And it doesn't have to be hunting and fishing. It could just be the outdoors and that. So.
Oh, my favorite memory of the outdoors? Yeah, I've done a lot of fishing over the years. I still have a scar on my thumb from my dad and grandfather taking me out and I, probably 4 years old and got a hook in it. But I think one of the greatest memories that I've had fishing was with my sons when they were like 10 and 12 on the Shenandoah River, teaching them to fly fish with smallmouth bass because there's so much action. You could keep that 10-year-old's mind occupied, right? And my biggest life lesson is probably something I've learned here recently as you get older. The two hardest things to do in life are figure out what makes you happy and then achieve it. And most people only do one because they can never really figure out what makes them happy. So you got to be settled a little bit and comfortable where you're at and be okay walking away and know that you're making the right decisions for you so you can stay happy. So that's I think the thing to do. And that does sort of connect to doing things in the outdoors, I mean, we enjoy that, so, enjoy life. It's short.
Yeah, so it's great having this discussion with you, and I just appreciate you taking the time. Really, the man who set me up to put in command and which led me to go into grad school, and I ended up in college fishing without him asking me to be a company commander for me, believing in me, investing into me. That's what I talk a lot about with what I did with what we do with the West Point. I invest time, and it started with him, and that's where that kind of came from. There's a lot of life lessons I could pull from him because he's got a plethora. We do, and he's got some great advice, and that's why I love sitting down talking with you, Jim. I really appreciate your time and everything you're doing. You continue to give back, and it's extended through me, the things that I do, and allow me to give back today because I don't know if you realize, but because of, not just from what you do, but because of all the people that I touch, it's a direct reflection of the leadership that you instilled in me, and that allows what you did to be given back even, twice-fold, threefold from what you did. And so I really appreciate it. Hey, if you want to know more about Army bass, buck, hog, or duck, or redfish, go to forceonforcetv.com, and we'll see you next week in San Antonio. Whoa!
Airborne all the way.
Thanks for listening to the Force on Force podcast. Join us next time as we dive into more topics from the Force on Force talk. For more information or to learn how to join the organization, visit our website at forceonforcetv.com.